The Pensacola Sea Monster Chapter 1, The Dive Plan. The summer sun beat down on Pensacola Beach, turning the white sand into a shimmering carpet that stretched as far as the eye could see. 5 teenage boys stood at the water's edge, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the Gulf of Mexico melted into the sky. The year was 1962, and the world was full of possibilities. Brian McCleary squinted against the glare, his hand shielding his eyes as he scanned the waves. "You really think we can make it out there, Warren?" Warren Felly, the tallest of the group, nodded confidently. 2 miles, tops. We've got the raft and the water's calm, it'll be a cinch. Eric Ruhl, always the voice of reason, chimed in. "I don't know, fellas. My old man says the currents can be tricky out by the Massachusetts." "Ah, come on, Eric." Larry Bill punched his friend's shoulder playfully. "Where's your sense of adventure? This is gonna be boss." Bradford Rice, the youngest of the group, fidgeted nervously with the straps of his backpack. "What if we see a shark?" Brian laughed, trying to mask his own apprehension. "The only thing we're gonna see is that old wreck, Brad. And maybe some cool fish if we're lucky." The USS Massachusetts loomed large in Brian's imagination. He'd heard stories about the decommissioned battleship, deliberately sunk as a target and now resting just below the surface. Playground for fish and adventure-seeking divers. The thought of exploring its rusted corridors sent a shiver of excitement down his spine. Warren clapped his hands together, drawing everyone's attention. "All right, let's go over the plan one more time. We paddle out on the raft, dive down to check out the wreck, and be back before our folks even know we're gone. Easy as pie." As Warren spoke, Brian couldn't help but notice a group of fishermen further down the beach, loading their boat with gear. One of the older men caught his eye and frowned, shaking his head slightly as if in disapproval. Brian felt a twinge of unease but quickly brushed it aside. What did some old guy know anyway? "Hey, Earth to Brian." Larry waved a hand in front of his face. "You with us, man?" Brian blinked, snapping back to attention. "Yeah, sorry. I was thinking about what we might find down there." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Like treasure?" "Nah. Probably just a bunch of rusty metal and fish poop," Bradford said with a grimace. The boys laughed, the sound carrying on the salt-tinged breeze. As they gathered their gear, masks, fins, and the prized 7-foot Air Force life raft they'd borrowed, without permission, from Warren's older brother, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced back at the fishermen, who were now huddled together, speaking in low tones and casting occasional glances in their direction. One of them, a weathered old salt with skin like tanned leather, broke away from the group and approached the boys. "You fellas heading out to the Massachusetts?" he asked, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes and sea spray. Warren puffed out his chest. "Yes, sir, we're going to explore the wreck." The old man's eyes narrowed. "Might want to reconsider that. Weather can turn on a dime out there. And there's things in them waters, things you don't want to mess with." Larry rolled his eyes. "Like what? Mermaids?" Fisherman didn't laugh. "Like things that ain't been seen topside in a million years. Things that should stay down in the deep where they belong." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Brian felt goosebumps rising on his arms despite the heat. Bradford was the first to speak. Voice small. "Maybe we should listen to him, guys. My mom would kill me if anything happened." "Don't be such a baby," Warren scoffed. "He's just trying to scare us. Probably doesn't want us messing up his fishing spot." The old man shrugged, already turning away. "Suit yourselves. But don't say old Jack didn't warn you." As he walked back to his boat, Brian called out, "Wait. What did you mean about things in the water?" Jack paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Some things are better left unseen, boy. The sea keeps her secrets for a reason." With that cryptic remark, he rejoined his companions, leaving the 5 friends to exchange uneasy glances. Eric cleared his throat. "So, we still doing this?" Warren hefted the deflated raft onto his shoulder. "You bet we are. Don't let some crazy old coot spook you. This is going to be adventure of a lifetime." As they made their final preparations, Brian found himself torn between excitement and a growing sense of foreboding. He watched as Larry helped Warren unfold the raft, its olive drab material a stark contrast against the pristine sand. "Last chance to back out," he said, trying to keep his tone light. 4 pairs of eyes turned to him, a mix of determination and nervous anticipation reflected in their gazes. "No way," Eric said, surprising everyone with his newfound resolve. "We came here to dive, and that's what we're gonna do." Bradford nodded, squaring his shoulders. "Yeah, what he said." Brian looked out at the gulf once more. The water sparkled invitingly, betraying no hint of the dangers that might lurk beneath its surface. He took a deep breath, tasting salt on his tongue, and made his decision. "All right then," he said, grabbing one end of the raft. "Let's do this." As they dragged the raft towards the water's edge, none of them noticed the dark clouds gathering on the distant horizon, a portent of the terror that awaited them in the depths of the Gulf of Mexico. Chapter 2. Departure and Initial Setback. The raft hit the water with a soft splash, bobbing gently on the incoming waves. Warren, grinning with excitement, was the first to clamber aboard. "Come on, you chickens," he called, waving the others forward. One by one, they waded into the warm Gulf waters. Brian felt the sand shift beneath his feet as he pushed the raft further out, the gentle current already tugging at his legs. As he hauled himself over the side, water sloshing around his ankles, a flutter of anticipation, or was it anxiety, stirred in his chest. "Man, this is gonna be boss," Larry exclaimed, echoing his earlier sentiment as he settled into position, oar in hand. The raft, designed for combat-trained airmen, groaned under the weight of 5 eager teenagers and their gear. Eric, ever the pragmatist, did a quick inventory. "Life jackets? Check," Bradford replied, patting the orange vests stowed near his feet. "First aid kit? Got it," Brian confirmed, tapping the small red bag tucked securely under the raft's edge. "Enough water and snacks?" Warren rolled his eyes. "Yes, Mom. And we go now?" With a coordinated effort, they began to paddle, their strokes clumsy at first, but soon finding a rhythm. The beach receded behind them, the sounds of vacationers and gulls fading into the gentle lapping of waves against the raft. For the first hour, the mood was buoyant. They joked and speculated about what they might find on the wreck, their voices carrying across the calm waters. The sun climbed higher, its heat tempered by a cool breeze that ruffled their hair and sent small ripples across the surface of the Gulf. "Hey, I think I see something," Bradford suddenly called out, pointing eagerly ahead. They all squinted in the direction he indicated, but there was nothing but endless blue. "Your eyes are playing tricks on you, Brad." Larry chuckled. The Massachusetts is still a ways off. As they continued to paddle, Brian noticed the first signs of trouble. Breeze, once refreshing, was picking up strength, and dark clouds were beginning to gather on the horizon. Guys," he said, trying to keep the worry out of his voice. "Maybe we should think about turning back. That sky doesn't look too friendly." Warren shook his head, determination etched on his face. "We've come this far. No way we're quitting now." But nature had other plans. Within minutes, the wind had whipped itself into a frenzy, churning the once placid Gulf into a maelstrom of choppy waves. The raft bucked wildly, nearly capsizing as a particularly large swell caught them broadside. "Holy cow," Eric yelped, clutching the sides of the raft. "This is getting hairy." Rain began to fall, fat droplets that stung their skin and obscured their vision. The shore was now a distant smudge, barely visible through the gathering storm. "We need to turn back," Brian shouted over the howling wind. This time, even Warren nodded in agreement, his earlier bravado washed away by the rain. They struggled to turn the raft, fighting against waves that seemed determined to push them further out to sea. Brian's arms burned with the effort, hands slipping on the rain-slicked oar. Suddenly, a sound cut through the storm's cacophony, the low, resonant blare of a ship's horn. "Look," Larry cried, pointing to their right. Through the curtain of rain, they could make out the hazy outline of a large vessel, running lights barely visible in the gloom. "Hey, over here!" Bradford screamed, waving his arms frantically. "Help us!" For a moment, hope surged through Brian's chest. Surely the ship would see them, would come to their rescue. But as quickly as it had appeared, the vessel vanished into the mist, its horn fading into the distance. "No," Eric wailed, his voice cracking. "Come back." The disappointment was crushing. They redoubled their efforts to paddle towards shore, but it was like trying to swim through molasses. The current, now working against them, seemed to laugh at their feeble attempts to make headway. As they struggled, Brian's eye caught something in the water. A dark shape, massive and sinuous, gliding just beneath the surface. His heart leaped into his throat. "Did you see that?" he gasped, but his words were lost in a crash of thunder. The shape vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Brian to wonder if it had been nothing more than a trick of the light, a phantom conjured by his fear-addled mind. Hours seemed to pass, though it was impossible to tell time in the chaos of the storm. Their world had shrunk to the confines of the raft, each moment a battle against the elements. Then, through a brief break in the clouds, Brian spotted something that made his blood run cold. "Oh no," he murmured. "What is it?" Warren asked, following his gaze. There, looming out of the churning seas like some ancient monolith, was a massive steel buoy. Surface was slick with algae and barnacles, testament to years of exposure to the Gulf's unforgiving waters. "We're way off course," Brian said, the reality of their situation sinking in. "That buoy? I think it's the one marking the Massachusetts." The others fell silent, the gravity of their predicament finally hitting home. They were miles from shore, caught in a storm, with night rapidly approaching. As if to punctuate their dire circumstances, a wave larger than any before smashed into the raft, sending them careening towards the buoy. Bradford screamed as they were sucked into the metallic behemoth's undertow. "Hold on," Brian yelled, gripping the raft with all his might as they were dragged under the buoy's massive bulk. For one terrifying moment, it seemed certain they would be crushed against the steel or pulled under entirely. The world became a blur of churning water and screaming wind. Brian felt his grip slipping, his lungs burning for air. Then, with a violent lurch, they were spat out on the other side of the buoy. The raft spun wildly, water sloshing over its sides but miraculously remained upright. Coughing and sputtering, 5 friends clung to each other and what remained of their vessel. As the buoy receded behind them, carried away by the current, full weight of their situation descended like a lead blanket. They were lost at sea, their equipment soaked or lost. No idea which way led to safety, and somewhere out there, unseen in the turbulent waters, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting. As darkness began to fall, transforming the angry sea into an inky void, Bradford voiced the question they were all thinking. What are we going to do now? The only answer was the howling of the wind and the relentless pounding of the waves, harbingers of the long night to come. Chapter 3. Lost at Sea. Darkness fell like a shroud over the Gulf of Mexico, bringing with it a new level of terror. The storm raged on, each flash of lightning illuminating a world gone mad with wind and water. In the small raft, 5 teenagers huddled together, their earlier bravado washed away by the relentless assault of the element. "We're gonna die out here," Bradford whimpered, words nearly lost in the howling gale. "Shut up," Warren snapped. There was more fear than anger in his voice. "We're not gonna die. We just need to wait it out." Brian, fighting to keep his teeth from chattering, tried to take stock of their situation. The raft, miraculously, was still intact, though waterlogged and sitting low in the churning seas. Most of their supplies were gone, lost to the waves during their harrowing encounter with the buoy. The life jackets, thank God, were still with them, but in the pitch black, it was impossible to tell what else had survived. A massive wave crashed over them, drenching the boys yet again. As they spluttered and coughed, spitting out mouthfuls of salty water, Eric's voice rose in panic. "I can't do this anymore. We have to do something." "Like what?" Larry shouted back. "We don't even know which way is shore." As if in answer to their desperation, a beam of light cut through the darkness. For a moment, Brian thought he was hallucinating. But then he heard it, the low, powerful thrum of an engine. "Look," he cried, pointing towards the source of the light. A boat. Hope, fragile but fierce, bloomed in their chests. They began to wave their arms frantically, screaming themselves hoarse as they tried to catch the attention of their potential rescuers. Boat drew closer, searchlight sweeping back and forth across the turbulent waters. Brian could make out its outline now. A large fishing trawler, its bulk rising and falling with the waves. "Hey, over here!" Warren bellowed, his voice cracking with the effort. For one heart-stopping moment, the searchlight fell directly on their raft. Brian locked eyes with a figure on the boat's deck, a man in a yellow slicker peering into the night. "They see us," Bradford cried, tears of relief mixing with the rain on his face. But then, inexplicably, the boat began to turn away. "No," Eric screamed. "Come back, please." They watched in disbelief as the trawler's lights receded into the distance, leaving them once again alone in the vast, uncaring sea. "Why? Why didn't they help us?" Larry asked, voice small and broken. Brian had no answer. The crushing weight of their abandonment settled over them like a physical thing, more suffocating than the waves that continued to crash against their tiny vessel. As the night wore on, the storm began to subside, but their situation remained dire. They drifted aimlessly, too exhausted to paddle, too afraid to sleep. The raft spun slowly in place, giving them dizzying glimpses of a horizon that never seemed to get any closer. In the eerie calm that followed the storm, new sounds began to emerge. The slap of waves against the raft, creak of the rubber as it flexed with each swell, and something else, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Do you guys hear that?" Brian asked, straining his ears. The others nodded, their eyes wide in the darkness. "What is it?" Bradford whispered. "Probably just the wind," Warren said, but he didn't sound convinced. The sound grew louder, a pulsing thrum that vibrated through the water and into their bones. And with it came a smell, an otherworldly stench that made their eyes water and their stomachs churn. "Oh God," Eric gagged. "What is that?" Before anyone could respond, the raft suddenly lurched, nearly capsizing. Something large had passed directly beneath them, displacing the water and sending waves rippling outward. "What the hell was that?" Larry yelped, clutching the sides of the raft. Brian's mind raced, remembering the shape he'd glimpsed earlier during the storm. I think there's something out there," he said, his mouth dry with fear. As if in response to his words, a splash erupted from the water just yards from their raft. In the dim pre-dawn light, they caught a glimpse of something breaking the surface, something long and sinuous, like the neck of some impossible creature. Bradford let out a strangled cry. "It's a sea monster. Don't be ridiculous." Warren snapped. His voice trembled. "There's no such thing as—" His words were cut off by another splash, closer this time. They all turned to see a massive shape silhouetted against the lightening sky. It looked like a telephone pole rising from the water, topped by a bulbous head easily the size of their raft. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the thing regarded them with eyes that gleamed with alien intelligence. Then, with a sound like tearing metal, it opened a maw lined with teeth as long as a man's arm. Panic exploded in the raft. Bradford screamed, a high, keening wail that seemed to go on forever. Eric began to pray, his words a desperate, jumbled plea for salvation. Larry and Warren grabbed the oars, futilely trying to paddle away from the monstrosity. Brian, frozen in terror, could only watch as the creature's head swayed back and forth, as if deciding which of them to devour first. Then, with a speed that belied its enormous size, it struck. The water erupted in a geyser of foam and spray. Bradford's scream cut off abruptly as he was yanked from the raft, disappearing into the churning sea in the blink of an eye. "Bradford!" Brian yelled, lunging for his friend's outstretched hand. But he was too late. Bradford was gone. The remaining boys stared at the empty space where their friend had been, uncomprehending. The creature had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only ripples on the water's surface to mark its passing. "We have to get out of here," Warren said, voice shaking. "We have to swim for it." "Are you crazy?" Eric cried. "That thing is still out there." But Warren was already moving, throwing himself over the side of the raft. "It's our only chance. Come on." One by one, driven by terror and the desperate need to do something, anything, they followed Warren into the water. The life jackets kept them afloat, but offered little comfort in the face of the horror that lurked beneath the waves. As they began to swim, Brian cast one last look at the abandoned raft. In the growing light of dawn, he could see dark stains on its surface. Bradford's blood, a stark reminder of the friend they'd lost and the danger that still hunted them. With heavy strokes, they pushed on through the water, not knowing if they were heading towards salvation or deeper into a nightmare, from which there might be no waking. Chapter 4. Drift in the fog. As the first rays of sunlight began to pierce the eastern sky, an eerie calm settled over the Gulf. The storm that had raged through the night was gone. leaving behind a glassy sea that stretched to the horizon in all directions. But any relief the 4 remaining boys might have felt was overshadowed by the horror of what they had witnessed, and the gnawing fear of what might still lurk beneath the placid surface. They swam in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, the rhythmic splash of their strokes, the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet. Brian's muscles ached with every movement, his waterlogged clothes dragging him down. He tried not to think about Bradford, about the way he had disappeared so suddenly, but the image played on repeat in his mind like a nightmarish film reel. "We need to rest," Eric gasped after what felt like hours. His face was pale, lips tinged blue from the cold. Warren, who had taken the lead, paused and treaded water. "Just a little further," he said, but the determination that had driven him through the night was fading, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. As they floated, catching their breath, a new threat began to materialize around them. Tendrils of fog crept across the water's surface, quickly thickening into an impenetrable white blanket that obscured everything beyond a few yards. "What the hell?" Larry muttered, his head swiveling as he tried to peer through the mist. Fog brought with it a bone-deep chill that seemed to sap what little strength they had left. Brian shivered uncontrollably, his teeth chattering so hard he thought they might break. "We can't keep swimming blind," he said, his voice hoarse from salt water and fatigue. "We could be going in circles for all we know." The others murmured in agreement, too exhausted to argue. With unspoken consensus, they clustered together, linking arms to avoid drifting apart in the murk. As they floated, time seemed to lose all meaning. The fog pressed in on them from all sides, muffling sound and distorting their senses. Brian found his mind wandering, drifting between moments of hyper-alertness and foggy delirium. In one of his more lucid moments, he became aware of a sound cutting through the silence. Low, pulsing hum seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You guys hear that?" he whispered, not wanting to speak too loudly in case of what, he wasn't sure. Eric nodded, his eyes wide with renewed fear. "It's back," he whimpered. The humming grew louder, reverberating through the water and into their bodies. With it came the smell, that same otherworldly stench they had encountered before Bradford was taken. It was the smell of ancient things, of decay and brine and something utterly alien. "Oh God," Warren gagged, fighting back the urge to vomit. "What is that?" Before anyone could respond, the water around them began to churn. Something massive was moving beneath the surface, displacing water and creating swells that threatened to pull them under. "Stay together," Brian yelled, tightening his grip on Eric and Larry. But the churning intensified, and suddenly Larry was yanked downward with a startled cry. For a split second, Brian saw his friend's terrified face disappear beneath the waves, and then he was gone. "Larry?" Warren screamed, lunging forward as if to dive after him. Brian and Eric barely managed to hold him back. "No," Brian shouted. "You'll only get yourself killed." The water calmed as quickly as it had erupted, leaving no trace of Larry save for the ripples slowly fading on the surface. The 3 remaining boys clung to each other, sobbing and shaking with fear and grief. As the fog continued to swirl around them, Brian became aware of shapes moving in the mist. Dark, undulating forms that seemed to coalesce and dissipate at the edge of vision. Were they real, or just figments of his oxygen-starved, terror-addled brain? "There's something out there," he whispered, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Eric whimpered, burying his face against Brian's shoulder. Warren, however, had gone eerily still, his gaze fixed on a point in the distance. "Warren," Brian said, shaking his friend gently. "What is it? What do you see?" When Warren spoke, his voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Watching us." Brian followed Warren's gaze and felt his heart stutter in his chest. There, barely visible through the fog, was a shape rising from the water. It looked like a telephone pole, just as before, but this time Brian could make out more details. The head was bulbous, covered in what looked like thick, rubbery skin. And the eyes, dear God, the eyes. They were huge, black as pitch, and filled with an intelligence that was utterly inhuman. For what felt like an eternity, they stared at the creature, and it stared back. Brian could feel its gaze boring into him, as if it were peering into his very soul. Then, with a sound like tearing metal that cut through the fog like a knife, it opened its maw. Warren screamed. It was a sound of pure, primal terror that Brian had never heard from his friend before, and hoped never to hear again. Before Brian could react, Warren tore himself free from their group and began to swim frantically away, disappearing into the fog. "Warren, no," Brian yelled, but it was too late. His friend was gone, swallowed by the mist. Left alone with Eric, Brian felt a wave of despair threaten to overwhelm him. They were lost, exhausted, and being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. How could they possibly survive? As if in answer to his unspoken question, the fog began to thin. Through the dissipating mist, Brian caught sight of something that made his heart leap. The dark shape of a ship, its outline becoming clearer, each passing moment. "Eric, look," he gasped, shaking his friend. "A ship, we're saved." But as the fog lifted further, Brian's elation turned to ash in his mouth. The ship was not their salvation, but a grim reminder of their predicament. Rising from the water like the skeletal finger of some long-dead giant was the unmistakable shape of the USS Massachusetts. They had come full circle, arriving at the very destination that had sparked their ill-fated adventure. And somewhere in the waters around the sunken battleship, a nightmare lurked, waiting to claim its next victim. Chapter 5, The Creature Attacks. The rusted hulk of the USS Massachusetts loomed before them, a silent sentinel in the Gulf's placid waters. In the eerie calm that followed the fog's dissipation, Brian and Eric clung to each other, their ragged breathing the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. "We can't stay here," Brian whispered, his eyes darting across the water's surface. Every ripple, every shadow seemed to promise death. "That thing, it's still out there." Eric nodded weakly, his face a mask of exhaustion and terror. "Where can we go? We don't even know which way is shore." Before Brian could respond, a sound cut through the air, a distant splash, followed by a cry that turned his blood to ice. "Help! Oh God, somebody help me!" Brian's head whipped around, searching for the source of the voice. "Warren?" bawled out, hope and dread warring in his chest. Another splash, closer this time, and Warren's voice rang out again. "Brian? Eric, it's coming. It's—" The words cut off abruptly, replaced by a gurgling scream that ended in a wet, choking sound. "Warren!" Brian yelled, but there was no response. Just the lapping of waves against the Massachusetts hull and the thundering of his own heart in his ears. Eric began to sob, quiet, broken sounds that spoke of a mind pushed to its breaking point. "We're next," whimpered. "Going to kill us all." Brian grabbed his friend's shoulders, forcing Eric to look at him. "Listen to me. We're not going to die here. We're going to make it to that ship, and we're going to find a way out of this. Do you understand?" For a moment, Eric just stared at him, his eyes wide and unfocused. Then slowly he nodded. "Okay," he whispered. With renewed determination, they began to swim towards the Massachusetts. Every stroke was agony, their muscles screaming in protest after hours in the water. Fear was a powerful motivator, and the thought of what lurked beneath the surface drove them on. They were barely 50 yards from the ship when Brian felt something brush against his leg. He froze, his heart leaping into his throat. "Eric," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Don't panic, but I think—" His words were cut short as something wrapped around his ankle and yanked him under. The world became a swirl of bubbles and murky green water. Brian thrashed wildly, his lungs burning as he fought against the inexorable pull of whatever had grabbed him. Just when he thought his lungs would burst, the pressure on his ankle released. Kicked frantically, breaking the surface with a desperate gasp. "Brian!" Eric screamed, paddling towards him. "Are you okay? What happened?" Before Brian could answer, the water behind Eric erupted. A long, sinuous shape rose into the air, water cascading off its glossy black skin. Brian caught a glimpse of enormous eyes, like obsidian pools, and rows of teeth that gleamed wickedly in the sunlight. Time seemed to slow. Brian saw Eric turn, saw the look of abject horror spread across his friend's face. He saw the creature's head dart forward, its jaws opening wide. And then Eric was gone, pulled under so quickly it was as if he had never been there at all. "No!" Brian screamed, the sound tearing from his throat. "Eric!" There was no sign of his friend, no bubbles rising to the surface, no thrashing in the water. Just a slowly expanding circle of red that made Brian's stomach lurch. Panic overtook him. He swam for the Massachusetts with every ounce of strength he had left. his arms and legs pumping furiously. He could feel the creature's presence behind him, almost sense its alien intelligence, considering its next move. The ship's hull was just feet away when something slammed into Brian from below, launching him clear of the water. For a heart-stopping moment, he was airborne, tumbling end over end. Then he crashed back into the gulf, the impact driving what little air remained from his lungs. Dazed and disoriented, Brian flailed in the water. His hands struck something solid, the barnacle-encrusted side of the Massachusetts. With desperate strength, he pulled himself towards it, fingers scrabbling for purchase on the rusted metal. A low, reverberating hum filled the water around him. Brian risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. The creature was there, its long neck extended, its massive head swaying back and forth as it regarded him with those terrifyingly intelligent eyes. Brian pulled himself higher on the ship's hull, his feet leaving the water. The creature let out a sound like tearing metal, a screech that sent shivers down Brian's spine. It lunged forward, jaws snapping shut inches from his legs. Adrenaline surged through Brian's veins. He climbed higher, ignoring the way the sharp edges of the rusted metal cut into his hands. The creature reared back, preparing for another strike. Brian could see down its gullet, smell the stench of decay and brine that wafted from its maw. In that moment, faced with imminent death, a strange calm settled over Brian. He thought of his friends, Bradford, Larry, Warren, Eric, all gone now, claimed by the Gulf and this impossible monster. He thought of his parents, of the life he might have had if they'd never set out on this foolish adventure. The creature's head shot forward. Brian closed his eyes, bracing for the end. But the end didn't come. Instead, he heard a dull thud and felt a shower of rust flakes rain down on him. He opened his eyes to see the creature shaking its massive head, dazed from impact with the ship's hull. Not wasting a moment, Brian resumed his climb. His muscles screamed in protest, but terror and the will to survive drove him on. Below, he could hear the creature thrashing in the water, could feel the vibrations of its furious roars through the metal of the ship. Finally, his hand found the edge of the deck. With one last monumental effort, Brian hauled himself over the side, collapsing onto the rusted steel plating. He lay there, gasping for breath, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. The creature's roars gradually faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Brian forced himself to his feet, stumbling to the railing on shaky legs. He peered over the side, scanning the water for any sign of the monster. The Gulf was calm, its surface unbroken save for gentle waves lapping against the ship's hull. Of the creature, there was no trace, but Brian knew better than to believe it was gone. It was out there, waiting, biding its time. As the adrenaline began to ebb, the full weight of what had happened crashed down on Brian. He was alone now, the sole survivor of a nightmare beyond imagining. His friends were gone, claimed by a monster that shouldn't exist. And he was trapped on the very shipwreck they had set out to explore, with no food, no water, and no hope of rescue. Brian sank to his knees, overwhelmed by exhaustion and grief. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on the weathered deck of the USS Massachusetts, he buried his face in his hands and wept. Chapter 6. The Final Encounter. The sun beat down mercilessly on the rusted deck of the USS Massachusetts, burning the metal into a scorching griddle. Brian huddled in what little shade he could find, his throat parched and his mind reeling from the horrors he had witnessed. Hours had passed since he'd climbed aboard the wreck, but the memory of his friends' deaths remained painfully fresh. As afternoon wore on, Brian's thoughts turned increasingly to rescue. Surely someone would come looking for them soon. Their parents would raise the alarm when they didn't return home. Coast Guard would launch a search, but a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts. They were miles off course, in a vast expanse of open water, and even if rescuers did come, would they believe his story? Or would they become the creature's next victims? A distant rumble drew Brian from his dark musing. He raised his head, squinting against the glare off the water. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, heralding another storm. Sight filled him with dread. If the seas grew rough, the partially submerged wreck might not offer much protection. As if summoned by his fears, a massive swell suddenly rocked the ship. Brian scrambled to his feet, clinging to a rusted railing as he scanned the waters around the Massachusetts. The surface was choppy, but he saw no sign of the creature. Still, an oppressive feeling of being watched settled over him. Thunder rumbled again, closer this time. The storm was approaching rapidly, the leading edge of dark clouds already blotting out the sun. As the first fat raindrops began to fall, Brian made a decision. He couldn't stay on the exposed deck. He needed to find shelter, somewhere defensible where he could wait out both the storm and any return of the monster. With trembling legs, he made his way towards what looked like a hatch leading below decks. The metal groaned ominously as he pulled it open, revealing a dark maw that smelled of rust and stagnant seawater. Brian hesitated, his instincts screaming at him not to trap himself in an enclosed space. But another crash of thunder made up his mind for him. He lowered himself through the hatch, his feet finding purchase on a ladder that creaked under his weight. The darkness below, absolute. Brian fumbled in his pocket, praying that his waterproof matches had survived the ordeal. His fingers closed around the small container, and he nearly wept with relief. Striking a match, Brian found himself in a narrow corridor. Water sloshed around his ankles, and the walls were covered in a thick layer of rust and marine growth. He moved cautiously, aware that any misstep could send him plunging into unseen depths. As he explored deeper into the ship's interior, Brian's mind conjured terrifying scenarios. What if the creature could somehow squeeze its massive bulk through the corridors? What if there were more of them, smaller ones that could navigate the tight spaces? Each shadow seemed to move. Every creak and groan of the ship's hull sounded like the approach of some nameless horror. Flash of lightning illuminated the corridor through a porthole, briefly revealing a large room ahead. Brian quickened his pace, hoping to find a secure space where he could wait out the storm. But as he entered the room, his blood ran cold. There, sprawled across what must have once been the ship's mess hall, were the remains of his friends. Bradford's life jacket, torn and bloodied, Larry's waterlogged sneakers, Warren's prized watch, the face cracked and the hands frozen at 3:17, and Eric's shark-tooth necklace, a souvenir from a happier day at the beach, now lying in a pool of brackish water. Brian's legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees among the grim reminders of his lost friends. Sobs racked his body. The full weight of their loss crashed over him anew. They had come here seeking adventure, and found only death. Sound cut through his grief. A low, pulsing hum that seemed to vibrate through the very metal of the ship. Brian's head snapped up, his tears forgotten as primal fear gripped him once more. That sound? It was the same one they had heard before each attack. Scrambling to his feet, Brian looked wildly around the room for an escape route. But the only way out was the corridor he had come through. And now, to his horror, he could hear something massive moving through the water-filled passageways, drawing ever closer. The hum grew louder, accompanied now by the screech of metal as something huge forced its way through spaces too small to accommodate it. Brian backed away until he hit the far wall, his eyes fixed on the doorway. A shape appeared in the opening, a long, sinuous neck topped by that nightmarish head. In the flickering light of the dying match, Brian could see every detail of the creature's alien visage. Its eyes, black and soulless, fixed upon him with terrifying intelligence. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of dagger-like teeth. As the creature lunged forward, time seemed to slow. In that eternal moment, Brian saw his whole life flash before his eyes. Childhood memories, the faces of his parents, the laughter of his friends. He saw the folly of their expedition, the hubris that had led them to this fate, and he saw with sudden clarity that some secrets of the deep were never meant to be uncovered by man. The match went out, plunging the room into darkness. The last thing Brian heard was the rush of water and the deafening roar of the creature as it closed in for the kill. Outside, oblivious to the drama unfolding within its rusted hull, the USS Massachusetts creaked and groaned as the storm raged around it. The waters of the Gulf churned, hiding whatever secrets lay beneath their surface, and somewhere in Pensacola, 5 families began to worry about their sons who had yet to return from what should have been a simple day at the beach. Chapter 7. Rescue and Disbelief. The harsh glare of fluorescent lights assaulted Brian's eyes as he slowly regained consciousness. For a moment, he lay still, disoriented and confused. The steady beep of a heart monitor and the antiseptic smell of a hospital room gradually filtered through his senses. "He's waking up," a voice said nearby, followed by the rustle of movement. Brian blinked, his vision clearing to reveal a stark white ceiling. He turned his head slightly, wincing at the stiffness in his neck, and saw a man in a white coat standing beside his bed. "Welcome back, son," the doctor said, his voice gentle. "You've been through quite an ordeal." Memories came flooding back in a rush. The storm, the raft, his friends disappearing one by one, the creature with its impossible size and alien eyes. Brian shot upright, his heart racing. "The others?" he gasped, his voice hoarse. "Did you find them? Are they okay?" The doctor's face fell, and he shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry, Brian. You were the only one we found." A nurse appeared on Brian's other side, adjusting his IV drip. "You're at the Pensacola Naval Base Hospital," he explained softly. "Some boys found you washed up on the beach yesterday morning. You've been unconscious for almost 24 hours. Brian's mind reeled. How had he gotten from the USS Massachusetts to the shore? The last thing he remembered was the creature cornering him in the ship's mess hall. Everything after that was a blank. Before he could voice any of his questions, the door opened and a man in a crisp naval uniform entered. He had a stern face, but his eyes were kind as he approached Brian's bed. "I'm Director E. McGovern of the Search and Rescue Units," he introduced himself. "I'm glad to see you awake, son. We've got a lot of questions for you." Over the next hour, Brian recounted his harrowing tale. He told them about the plan to explore the Massachusetts, the sudden storm that had blown them off course, and the terrifying encounters with the sea creature. As he spoke, he could see the doubt growing in their eyes. When he finished, Director McGovern cleared his throat. "That's quite a story, Brian. But are you sure that's what happened? You were out there for a long time. The mind can play tricks when you're dehydrated and scared." "I know what I saw," Brian insisted, frustration building. "It was real. It killed my friends." The doctor stepped in, his voice soothing. "Brian, you've been through a traumatic experience. It's not uncommon for the mind to create explanations for things it can't understand. What you're describing, well, it's just not possible." Brian felt a wave of despair wash over him. They didn't believe him. How could they, when he could scarcely believe it himself? "We've got search teams combing the area," Director McGovern said. "If your friends are out there, we'll find them. In the meantime, you need to rest and recover." As they left the room, Brian overheard the director speaking to the doctor in low tones. "Poor kid's been through hell. Probably hallucinated the whole thing. Make sure he gets a psych eval before we release him." Alone in the sterile hospital room, Brian stared out the window at the Gulf of Mexico, its waters deceptively calm under the afternoon sun. He knew the truth was out there, hidden beneath those placid waves. But who would believe him? The next few days passed in a blur of medical tests, police interviews, and visits from worried parents. Brian stuck to his story, even as he saw the growing concern in his mother's eyes and the thinly veiled skepticism of the authorities. The media descended on Pensacola, turning the disappearance of 4 teenagers into a national sensation. Brian watched from his hospital bed as reporters on TV speculated about what might have happened. Not once did they mention a sea monster. A week after he was found, a Coast Guard cutter brought in a body. It was Bradford, or what was left of him. The official report cited shark attack as the cause of death. Brian knew better, but his protests fell on deaf ears. As he was finally cleared to go home, Brian overheard 2 nurses whispering in the hallway. "Poor kid," one said. "Survivor's guilt is a terrible thing, imagining some monster to explain why he lived and his friends didn't." "I heard they found traces of some kind of hallucinogenic algae in the water where they think the boys were," the other replied. "That would explain the crazy story." Brian clenched his fists, fighting back tears of frustration. He knew what he had seen, what he had experienced. But with each passing day, with each rational explanation offered by experts, he felt the truth slipping away. As his father drove him home, Brian stared out at the Gulf, its waters glittering innocently in the sunlight. Somewhere out there, in the depths that humans had barely begun to explore, he knew the creature was waiting. And he wondered, a chill running down his spine when it would strike again. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. The weeks following Brian's return home were a surreal blur of grief, frustration, and mounting isolation. Quaint beach town of Pensacola, once a haven of sun-soaked memories and carefree summers, had transformed into a claustrophobic fishbowl of whispers and sidelong glances. Brian's parents tried their best to shield him from the worst of it, but there was no escaping the reality of his situation. He was the sole survivor of a tragedy that had claimed 4 young lives, and his account of what happened was too fantastic for anyone to believe. One particularly difficult afternoon, Brian sat on the front porch, absently leafing through a stack of condolence cards. The words blurred together, a litany of well-meaning but hollow platitudes. "So sorry for your loss. Thinking of you in this difficult time. May they rest in peace." None of them understood. None of them could. A shadow fell across the cards, and Brian looked up to see Mr. Felly, Warren's father, standing at the foot of the porch steps. The man's face was haggard, eyes sunken with grief and sleepless nights. "Mr. Felly," Brian said, his throat suddenly dry. I'm so sorry about Warren." Warren's father climbed the steps slowly, his movements those of a man who had aged decades in a matter of weeks. He sat down heavily beside Brian, staring out at the street with unfocused eyes. "I keep expecting to see him," Mr. Felly said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Coming home from school, or running down the beach with you boys. But he's gone. They're all gone." Brian felt tears pricking at his eyes. "I tried to save them," he choked out. "I swear I tried." Mr. Felly turned to look at him, his gaze sharpening. "I know you did, son. And I know you believe what you saw out there was real." For a moment, hope flared in Brian's chest. Finally, someone who believed him. But Mr. Felly's next words extinguished that hope as quickly as it had ignited. "The mind does strange things when we're scared, when we can't explain something," he continued. "I don't blame you for what happened. But this story about a sea monster, it's not helping anyone. It's not bringing our boys back." Brian opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his lips. Pain in Mr. Felly's eyes was too raw, too deep. Arguing about the reality of what he'd seen suddenly seemed cruel in the face of such grief. As Mr. Felly left, patting Brian's shoulder with a trembling hand, Brian felt something inside him shift. The certainty that had sustained him through the doubts and disbelief began to crack. That night, unable to sleep, Brian crept down to the beach. The moon hung low over the water, casting a silvery path across the gentle waves. He stood at the water's edge, letting the cool surf wash over his feet. "I know you're out there," he whispered, his words carried away by the salt-tinged breeze. "I know what I saw, but maybe it doesn't matter anymore." The Gulf remained silent, offering no answers, no validation of his experiences. As Brian turned to head back home, he caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision, a long, sinuous shape breaking the surface far out on the moonlit water. He blinked and it was gone. Real or imagined? Truth or delusion born of trauma? Brian no longer knew which answer he hoped for. The days that followed saw a gradual shift in Brian's demeanor. He stopped insisting on the veracity of his monster story, instead retreating into a shell of quiet grief. His parents, while concerned, seemed relieved that he was no longer clinging to what they saw as a stress-induced hallucination. Media attention began to wane as newer tragedies captured the public's imagination. The disappearance of the 4 Pensacola teens became just another sad footnote in the annals of maritime disaster. For Brian, the weight of what he had experienced, whether real or imagined, continued to press down on him. He found himself avoiding the beach, flinching at the sound of waves. The Gulf, once a source of joy and adventure, now loomed in his mind as a vast, inscrutable threat. As summer gave way to fall, Brian returned to school. The halls felt different now, emptier without the presence of his friends. Caught snippets of conversation as he passed groups of students, words like survivor's guilt and PTSD following him like persistent shadows. In his marine biology class, a subject that had once fascinated him, Brian now sat with his head down, avoiding the teacher's concerned gaze. When they covered a unit on deep-sea creatures, he had to excuse himself, the images in the textbook stirring up memories he was trying desperately to suppress. One day, as he was leaving school, He overheard two teachers talking in low voices. "It's such a shame," one said. "He was such a bright, outgoing kid before the accident." "Trauma changes people," the other replied, "especially at that age. I just hope he can find a way to move past it." Brian quickened his pace, their words echoing in his mind. Move past it. Was that even possible? How could he move past something he wasn't sure he understood? As he walked home, his path taking him along the shoreline, Brian found himself staring out at the Gulf. The water sparkled innocently in the afternoon sun, betraying no hint of the horrors he believed lurked in its depth. For a moment, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that everyone else was right, that the stress and fear of that night had caused his mind to conjure up an impossible monster, that his friends had simply drowned in a tragic accident. But then he remembered the creature's eyes, alien intelligence he had seen in them. He recalled the sound it made, like tearing metal, and the horrifying speed with which it had snatched his friends from existence. No, he thought, clenching his fists at his sides. It was real. It had to be real. Because the alternative, that his mind had fabricated such an elaborate explanation for the loss of his friends, was almost too terrible to contemplate. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Brian made a decision. He couldn't keep living like this, trapped between belief and doubt, between the truth as he knew it and the reality everyone else accepted. He needed proof. He needed to go back out there, to face his fears and find evidence of the creature's existence. Only then could he finally put this nightmare to rest, one way or another. With a mix of determination and dread settling in his stomach, Brian began to plan his return to the waters that had claimed his friends and nearly taken his own life. Whatever the truth was, he would face it head on, no matter the cost. Chapter 9: Seeking Answers. The soft glow of Brian's desk lamp illuminated a chaotic spread of maps, tide charts, and newspaper. For weeks, he had been meticulously planning his return to the Gulf, driven by a desperate need for validation or closure. He wasn't sure which anymore. A knock at his bedroom door startled him. "Brian," his mother's voice called. "Dinner's ready." "Be right there, Mom," he replied, hastily covering his research with a textbook. As he joined his parents at the dinner table, Brian could feel their worried glances. Forced normalcy of their conversation only highlighted how much had changed. "How was school today, honey?" his mother asked, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Brian shrugged. "Fine, just busy with a project." His father cleared his throat. "You know, son, if you ever want to talk about, well, anything, we're here for you." The concern in their voices made Brian's chest tighten. He knew they were trying their best, but how could he explain that the only way to move forward was to go back? After dinner, Brian retreated to his room, resuming his planning. He had managed to piece together the likely location of the USS Massachusetts based on Coast Guard reports and his own fragmented memories. The wreck wasn't a popular dive site, which worked in his favor. He didn't want anyone else getting hurt when he found proof of the creature's existence. As midnight approached, Brian's eyelids grew heavy. He was about to call it a night when a small article at the bottom of a yellowed newspaper clipping caught his eye. It mentioned a local fisherman, Jack Murdoch, who had been ridiculed for years for his claims of seeing a sea monster in the Gulf. Brian's heart raced. Could this be the corroboration he'd been searching for? He made a mental note to track down Jack Murdoch as soon as possible. The next day after school, Brian rode his bike to the docks where the local fishing boats moored. It took some asking around, but he finally found Jack Murdoch, a weathered old salt with skin like tanned leather, mending nets on the deck of a battered trawler. "Excuse me, Mr. Murdoch," Brian called out. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" The old fisherman squinted at him. "You're that McCleary boy, ain't ya? The one who survived that thing out in the Gulf?" Brian nodded, surprised to be recognized. "Yes, sir. I was hoping to ask you about what you've seen out there." Jack's eyes narrowed, but he gestured for Brian to come aboard. As they sat on weathered crates on the deck, the old man studied Brian intently. "Nobody believed me neither, Jack said finally. "Saw it clear as day 30 years ago. Long neck, head like a giant eel, eyes that seemed to look right through you. Damn near capsized my boat." Brian leaned forward eagerly. That's it. That's exactly what I saw, Mr. Prang. Murdoch, you have to tell people. If we both come forward. Jack held up a calloused hand, cutting him off. Won't do no good, boy. People believe what they want to believe. The sea keeps her secrets, and most folks prefer it that way. Disappointment washed over Brian, but the old fisherman wasn't finished. But I'll tell you this, Jack continued, his voice low. That thing, whatever it is, it ain't natural. It comes from somewhere deep, somewhere we ain't meant to go. You best leave it be, son. Ain't nothing good gonna come from chasing monsters. Brian left the docks with a mix of validation and frustration. Jack Murdoch's account matched his own experience perfectly. The old man's warning gnawed at him. Was he right? Should Brian just try to forget what he'd seen and move on with his life? As he pedaled home, the sun setting over the Gulf painted the sky in breathtaking shades of orange and pink. Brian found himself slowing, then stopping, his eyes drawn to the water. It looked so peaceful, so innocuous. How could something so terrible lurk beneath that tranquil surface? In that moment, staring out at the vast expanse of the Gulf, Brian made his decision. Couldn't live with the uncertainty, with the constant questioning of his own sanity. He needed to know, once and for all, the creature was real. Over the next few weeks, Brian put his plan into action. He saved every penny from his after-school job, using the money to quietly rent a small motorboat. Under the guise of working on a school project, he borrowed his father's old underwater camera. Late at night, he snuck out to practice using the boat, building his confidence for the journey ahead. Finally, on a crisp autumn morning, Brian left a note for his parents and set out before dawn. As he guided the small boat out of the harbor and into the open Gulf, a mix of determination and fear churned in his stomach. Coordinates he had painstakingly calculated led him to a stretch of water that looked no different from any other. But as he cut the engine and let the boat drift, Brian felt a familiar chill run down his spine. This was the place. He could feel it. With trembling hands, he prepared the underwater camera. He hesitated for just a moment before slipping into the water, the weight belt around his waist pulling him down into the murky depths. The water was colder than he expected, and darker. Shafts of sunlight penetrated only so far before being swallowed by the gloom. Brian swept the camera back and forth, straining his eyes for any sign of movement. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. His lungs began to burn, urging him to surface. But just as he was about to give up and head back to the boat, he saw it. A massive shape moving in the distance, undulating with impossible grace for its size. Brian's heart pounded in his ears as he raised the camera, his finger hovering over the shutter button. This was it. Proof. Validation. The answer to every doubt and dismissal he'd endured. The shape drew closer, resolving into the nightmarish form that had haunted his dreams for months. Long neck, bulbous head, eyes that seemed to glow with an otherworldly intelligence. It saw him. In that moment, as the creature's gaze locked onto him, Brian realized the terrible mistake he had made. He wasn't the hunter here. He was the prey. The camera slipped from his nerveless fingers as he kicked frantically for the surface. The creature surged forward with impossible speed, its maw opening wide to reveal rows of dagger-like teeth. Brian broke the surface with a desperate gasp, clawing his way back into the boat. The water around him churned violently as the creature circled, preparing to strike. With shaking hands, Brian started the engine. As he opened the throttle, pushing the small boat to its limits, he cast one last glance over his shoulder. The creature's head rose from the water, its eyes fixed on him with what Brian could only describe as hunger. Not just for flesh, but for the secret of its existence. In that moment, Brian understood Jack Murdoch's warning with terrible clarity. Some secrets, he realized as he sped back towards the shore, were never meant to be uncovered. And some mysteries were better left unsolved. Chapter 10. The Lingering Mystery. The small boat skimmed across the waves, its engine straining as Brian pushed it to its limits. His heart thundered in his chest, every fiber of his being screaming at him to go faster. Put as much distance as possible between himself and the horror he'd left behind. As the shoreline of Pensacola Beach came into view, Brian risked a glance over his shoulder. The Gulf stretched out behind him, placid and innocent looking in the late morning sun. There was no sign of pursuit, no monstrous head breaking the surface. But the image of those alien eyes, filled with hunger and ancient intelligence, was seared into his mind. Brian guided the boat into the harbor with trembling hands, nearly colliding with the dock in his haste to make land. As he stumbled onto solid ground, his legs gave way, and he collapsed onto the weathered planks, gasping for air. "Hey, kid, you all right?" A gruff voice cut through the fog of Brian's panic. He looked up to see Jack Murdoch hurrying towards him, concern etched on his weathered face. I saw it," Brian managed to choke out. "It was real. It was all real." Jack's expression darkened. He glanced around to ensure they were alone before helping Brian to his feet. "Come on, son. Let's get you somewhere quiet." In the cramped cabin of Jack's boat, Brian recounted his encounter, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. The old fisherman listened in grim silence, his eyes growing more troubled with each detail. When Brian finished, Jack let out a long, weary sigh. "I warned you, didn't I? Told you to leave it be. But now we have proof," Brian insisted. "We can tell people, show them." He broke off, suddenly realizing his hands were empty. In his panic to escape, he'd left the camera behind. Jack seemed to read his mind. "Ain't no proof, boy, just your word against the whole world's common sense. And we both know how that turns out." The truth of Jack's words hit Brian like a physical blow. He slumped in his seat, the adrenaline draining from his system and leaving him utterly exhausted. "What do I do now?" he asked, voice small and lost. Jack regarded him for a long moment before answering. "You live, son. You go on living, knowing the truth but understanding that some truths ain't meant for everyone." In the days that followed, Brian struggled to come to terms with his experience. He was torn between the need to warn others of the danger lurking in the Gulf and the knowledge that doing so would only lead to more ridicule and disbelief. His parents, noting his renewed agitation, suggested he speak with a therapist. Brian agreed, found himself unable to share the full truth of what had happened. Instead, he talked about his grief for his lost friends, his feelings of guilt and isolation. It helped in its way, but the weight of his secret remained. As weeks turned into months, Brian slowly began to rebuild his life. He returned to school, joined the swim team much to everyone's surprise, and even started making new friends. But he never went back in the Gulf, and his eyes would often drift to the horizon, searching for a glimpse of something that defied explanation. One crisp autumn day, nearly a year after his ill-fated expedition, Brian found himself walking along the beach. The sand was cool beneath his feet, and the cry of gulls filled the air. As he neared the pier, he spotted a familiar figure, Jack Murdoch, gazing out at the water with a faraway look in his eyes. "Mr. Murdoch," Brian called out as he approached. The old fisherman turned, a hint of a smile creasing his weathered face. "Brian, good to see you, son. How you been holding up?" Brian shrugged. "Okay, I guess. Taking it day by day." Jack nodded, understanding in his eyes. They stood in companionable silence for a while, watching the waves roll in. Finally, Brian spoke. "Do you think we'll ever know? Really know what's out there?" Jack chuckled, but there was little humor in it. "The sea's been keeping her secrets since long before we came along, boy, and she'll go on keeping them long after we're gone." Paused, gazed distant. Maybe that's for the best. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, Brian felt a sense of peace settle over him. The mystery of what lurked in the depths of the Gulf would always be a part of him, a truth he carried that others might never understand. But perhaps he realized that was okay. He thought of his friends, Warren, Eric, Bradford, and Larry. Their loss still ached, a wound that might never fully heal. But now, alongside the grief, there was a determination to live, to honor their memory by embracing the life they'd been denied. As darkness fell and the first stars began to twinkle overhead, Brian took one last look at the Gulf. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of human understanding, ancient creatures swam in lightless depth. And while part of him would always wonder, always seek answers, he knew now that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. With a nod to Jack, Brian turned and began the walk home. The sound of the waves followed him, a constant reminder of the thin line between the known and the unknown, between the world we think we understand and the vast, unknowable realms that lie just beyond our reach. As he climbed the steps to his house, Brian paused, looking back at the darkened beach. For a moment he thought he saw something, a long, sinuous shape breaking the surface far out on the moonlit water. Blinked, and it was gone. Real or imagined? Truth or illusion? In the end, Brian realized, it didn't matter. The mystery would endure, as it always had, a testament to the endless wonders and terrors of the deep. With a small smile, Brian opened his front door and stepped inside, leaving the secrets of the Gulf to the night and the endless, rolling waves. The end.